Okay, for this project you're going to want to get some protective gloves, a canister of JB Water Weld, a disposable cup, some sculpting tools, wire brush, and some razor scrapers, and also a protective surface for what you're working on. In my case, I'm using a purple towel. Alright, so we're going to be starting some repair work on what appears to be a fiberglass shell and concrete pour fountain. This was a freebie. Picked it up curbside. That's my cat offering his assistance over there. I'm wearing a headlamp, so hopefully you can get a little bit better lighting, but you can see that there's a small stress fracture in the fiberglass, probably from someone trying to manipulate the pump that was fed through. That's the cord hole. You'll have a better understanding of what I'm talking about when we do the other side. But I've decided that we are going to repair the underside first, so that as we are pressing the epoxy into this seam, for lack of a better word, this crack, that it'll actually have something stronger to be pressing against, so we don't just reopen what we're trying to repair. Trying to get it to bond as best as possible. So we'll go ahead and give that a scrape. Okay, so you can see the freshly knocked down areas. You know, it's just to clear the debris. This was the inside of the fountain, so it wasn't really exposed to the elements, but there were some cobwebs and unusual organic matter. Probably the best thing that you can find for your money, unless you want to just really go for it with like Bondo or some other fiberglass. This is a product for potable projects, JB Water Weld. It's an easy to use epoxy. Work in a well ventilated area. It is non-toxic once it's cured, but while you're working with it, it smells like burning hair. There's really no other way to describe it. Not such a great smell. So let's go ahead and mix up the epoxy and let's get started. JB Water Weld will also work on wet surfaces. I haven't tried this, but that's what the package says. It's a really easy to use product. It's a two-part epoxy that you mix. I do wear gloves. This is not fun trying to get it off your skin afterwards. When they put safety directions on a product, you are wise to heed their warnings, because there's really not an effective way to get this off of yourself, so be careful. You can see the gray coloring, and this will be thoroughly mixed once this is a off-white color. I've used this before. There are similar products that are easier to tell when you have it properly mixed, because it'll be using pink or blue or something where you can tell, but this is a consistently good product to work with, so let's continue. Okay, and we can see that the epoxy is mixed to a slightly off-white color. The gray is thoroughly incorporated. There are no streaks. So, and this has about a 10-minute working time. Okay, so I took that portion of epoxy that was in the disposable cup and rolled it out into one long bead. It's important, if you're trying to make a watertight repair, to not have a bunch of disconnected parts that you then try to smooth. It just increases your odds of keeping everything watertight if you don't put in any extra seams or any places where it can fracture. So the next thing we're going to do is we're going to use our fingers and our very, very thin, flexible palette knife, and we're going to try to keep the epoxy thick on the ridge and kind of feather it down into the edges as we go, not only to help make a better bond on either side of the seam, but also for adherence. This stuff does want to stick to plastic and fiberglass pretty readily, but sometimes it needs a little help. There's a lot of unevenness in this blowform texture from when they made the fiberglass forming. So we're going to have to do our best to try to accommodate all the uneven surfaces, which is why we pre-scraped with the razor. Okay, well that was a little tricky, only because this epoxy media wants to stick to your work gloves. So what I recommend when you are pressing down is to actually do a two-part takeaway where you lift your physical finger and then allow the glove to release itself from the surface of the epoxy, because if you just pull your hand away, you will take up your bead of epoxy. And you can see a little bit of an area right through there where I actually had to kind of fold it down over itself. It's not a break, but it really did hang on to my glove. So we're just going to go ahead and keep finger pressing this in to make sure it has good contact. Clear any debris. I actually rotated this so you can see it better, and I knocked down a high spot in the manufacturer's forming right here, just to make sure that I got coverage of where it could potentially try to continue the fracture. So we'll continue to mash this down. Okay, so that's pretty well mashed down. It's probably a 32nd of an inch. You can go thicker if you have a bigger stress crack to press down your bead and give it more surface area to attach to, but I'm feeling pretty comfortable with that. So now we're just going to blend the epoxy edges into the existing fiberglass and try to work around the flash from the manufacturer's mold as best we can, and we'll be ready to turn it over. So you know that's effectively grabbing into the texture of the fiberglass to help make a good bond. And you can do this either with the palette knife, or I'm actually having better luck just because this is kind of a small opening, to switch over to just some cheapo plastic sculpting tools. These have probably been around since, I don't know, the 70s at least, so you will definitely get your money's worth if you invest in these to keep in your toolkit. Just take little bites and roll it down off that high point. Now that's pretty well connected. This is about 1.5 inches beyond the fracture, and this actually has a nice big glob of old fiberglass that I'm connecting into, so we're just going to keep pressing this down, feathering it in, and not disturbing the supportive part of the bead, because that's going to do all the work for waterproofing. And we'll just keep using our handy little clothespin, because that actually lets me get my whole hand down inside and still have room to manipulate the tool. The thing about JB Weld is that you can actually form it to itself in various stages of being cured, and it will all eventually cure to the same hardness. What I did, just to hedge my bets, because of where the original crack or stress fracture was, I went ahead and reinforced part of this opening. Put a little bit down over the edge, built up this corner where they meet, and just fanned it down to blend in with the rest of this bond. And now we'll just go ahead and flip this fountain over, and we'll do the same thing on the other side. And depending on your fountain, you're going to want to be very careful not to bust off these tabs, because this is how this is going to eventually reattach to the base, which is not pictured in this video as of yet. So double up a towel, do something to help keep from stressing out these plastic tabs. Alright, we got the fountain flipped over, and there's a lot of peeling paint. Someone obviously changed the finish on this some time ago, and we're not going to worry about that today. This is a pretty easy fix with a lot of the new high-tech spray paints that are out there. And I've begun by lightly scraping away the paint, making sure I have a clean surface to attach to. And if I can zoom this in, you can see that the bead from the underside has actually pushed this open a little bit, and that's okay. It just gives more for the top side bond that we're working on now to fill in this void and grab into. So we're going to go ahead and let that set underneath for about a half hour or so. Doesn't really take a whole lot of time to cure, hard as a rock, so, and it's pretty well on its way. And you can also see, if I peek down, you can see that little ridge of the epoxy that I just blended back up into this collar for the cord, and of course the purple towel underneath that's catching all of this fiberglass and scrapings and stuff. So when you're done, you can either shake the towel outside, you know, shake it into the trash, give it a wash. So most of the mess should be landing right on the towel, which is always a good thing to make cleanup much simpler. So I'm going to go ahead and continue scraping at this, make sure we have a good surface. Let this set up for about another half hour, and then we'll get back to finishing up this repair job. And you can see at this point that I'm almost burnishing the surface with the razor blade. You want it to be nice, smooth, get all the debris out. Again, we're not worried about paint so long as we are getting rid of about an inch up. And I'm going to take the bead all the way to this wall, and I'm going to bring it up a little bit on this collar too. So as long as it's clear in our path, then we're not really going to worry about the rest of it for right now. You hear that razor catching in that crack, which is actually an okay thing. It'll just give the epoxy more places to grab. And you can see, now that we're just burnishing it with the razor, it's almost a different, not so much a color, but we're giving it a sheen. So we might want to think about going over this with a wire brush, just to make sure that we got all of the dust and debris out. And then we will be ready to go. This wire brush has seen a lot of hours. I think we got this in a 3-pack from Ace Hardware for around $8, and looks a little beat up, but this has put in a lot of surface, so definitely worth the investment. Even they do kind of look like a shaggy Muppet. It's very pokey. Stainless steel Muppet fur. Okay, so we kicked all the dust and debris out of the way from where we're working. If you were in a real workshop, you would probably just hook up a shop vac and get rid of all that, but we'll get it with a damp cloth a little later. And took some of the sheen down where the razor had burnished the fiberglass, and I think we are ready to mix up another batch of epoxy and finish this off. Alright, and you can see I got my bead of epoxy ready to go. It'll go all the way to the wall. I have enough to kind of build it up against here. It didn't actually crack up to it, but it's pretty close, so I just want to make sure I got that. And then we can feather it down almost 1.5 inches past this point. You could, if you wanted to, actually bring it all the way down to this wall. It'd be even stronger, but we're just gonna go with that. That'll be pretty good. And you can definitely hear and see what I'm talking about with it does not want to release your glove once it starts curing. But we have it centered on our seam where the fracture was. I'm going to go back to, probably part of a clothespin, honestly, because it seems to be the most effective thing for getting leverage in kind of a small space. So we're going to feather down the edges and we'll call this done. Okay, we got our bead of epoxy nicely adhered. It's feathered down. I don't see water being able to sneak underneath that, and it's already curing. You can tell because you can see a little bit of pink. That's the epoxy melting my tool a little bit chemically. That's kind of interesting. But feeling pretty good about this repair, so we're going to let it set up and cure for at least 24 hours. And after about 30 minutes or so, it should stop being tacky, and then I can work on scraping off all of this loose paint with that wire brush. Alright, and we're back for phase 2 of working on this repair of the curbside freebie water fountain. And this part of the procedure is pretty simple. We're going to take a wire brush and just start scraping away at some of this paint. And my rule for this kind of job is if it flakes off, it goes. If it tenaciously sticks, it can stay. Because the type of paint we're going to be using over this won't really matter. You just want to get all the loose stuff off. This epoxy has been curing for about a half hour now. And it is hard as a rock. So while we're waiting for that to fully cure over the next 24 hours, I can go ahead and do something nice, comfortable inside and just knock off all of this loose paint. We can do our water test up to the spout, of course, see if that made the repair, and then we can go ahead and give this a new coat of paint. However, as I started working down in this corner, I'm beginning to suspect that there's a hairline crack forming where this wall and that meets. So I'm going to go ahead and mix up another batch of epoxy and get it smooshed in there real good. And then we'll be able to pick up with water testing tomorrow.